Well, good afternoon, everyone. Or does it kind of feel like good evening after 2 whole days? Before I start, I'm going to ask you to just play along with me for a minute here, because we're going to be talking about disability, and I thought it would be helpful for us just to get a feeling for who we're really talking about. So I'm going to ask everyone to stand up who can. Stand up who can, everybody. I am Canadian, by the way. If I was American, I might want to ask you to dance or something. Promise, I promise, I'm not going to do that. What I want you to do now is I'm going to read out a list of things, impairments that happen to people that get called disabilities. And if you have this, or if you know someone who does, I want you to sit down. So if you have it yourselves, diabetes, or you know someone who does have diabetes, I want you to sit down. So the first one is diabetes. My dear, I thought I was dyslexia, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, learning disabilities, RSI, you know, their hands, arms start to go, carpal tunnel, severe migraines, arthritis, HIV, AIDS, heart conditions, chronic fatigue, ME. Well, I could have kept going, but there's no one left. Now, I could have gone into visual impairment, hearing impairment, multiple sclerosis, cancer, motor neuron, mental health conditions, anxiety, depression, etc. I did this once with an audience of 500 people in the UK, and I went through the whole list, and everyone was sitting down except one guy, and the rest of us decided afterwards he was deaf. Now, my point being that when we're talking about people with disabilities, it's so easy for us to think we're talking about them. I think we just saw we're talking about us. It's either us or people in that little us circle that we call quite close to us. So to start quickly with a bit of intro about my organization, as you heard, we are a business-funded, business-led organization focused on making it easier to both do business with and employ disabled people. Launched in '91 with Prince Charles. He makes it easier to attract attention. The premise is that our 350 members, who between them employ about 20% of the UK workforce, joint fund a central expert team, 35 people, who do nothing but make it easier for these companies and public sector employers to get it right. And so the premise was, when we were set up, on one side, a waste of human potential. Depends on the numbers. World Health, 15% of any population. I think in Canada you quote 16%. We're saying about 18% in the UK. The point is 15% of the population being denied the opportunity to contribute, and that it was too hard for the well-intentioned employer to get it right. What do you do with the rest, then, you ask? And actually, and it's the core of our conversation this evening, is we were set up because the system that is supposed to help disabled people into work fails both the employer and the person. Because it fails the employer, it fails the person. And so we asked ourselves, what if a group of companies came together and at least one player in this system started to behave differently? Could we change the worldview of business so that it saw disability in a completely different way? And if the business community behaved differently, could we drive change across other players in that system? So before I continue with the main thrust of my remarks, I have to say 3 quick things. One is I'm going to talk about employers, but I mean both private and public sector. Public sector as an employer, huge impact. And I think whatever country I go to, the public sector has as much to learn about employing disabled people as anybody else. But when I use the term, here both, though much of my focus will naturally be on the private sector for the purposes of how do you build bridges with employers. Secondly, customers really matter when you're trying to get a business leader to shift his understanding, or when you're trying to actually promote a new way of thinking. So what we've learned is that when you remove barriers for customers, you remove barriers for employees and applicants. The system is missing a trick by not actually engaging with messages about customers when trying to persuade employers to come on board. But I will be focusing, because I've got such a short period of time, on employment for the rest of my conversation. And finally, I wanted to talk about language, this political correct stuff, because you'll hear me say disabled people. I heard persons with disabilities very carefully earlier. I wanted to explain why I use both terms. Many people do prefer the language of persons with disabilities, and often it's people who became disabled later in life, or it's those who actually hear the word disabilities as kind of insulting and are trying to keep it as far away from the person word as they can. That's my personal view of when it becomes obsessive. On the other hand, we have many disabled people in Europe, political activists pushing for rights, who see it as a statement that they are disabled. They are disabled people who've been disabled by the state's refusal to give them a bus they can get on. And so for them, it's very important positioning. And then I had a friend, now no longer with us, who'd spent his entire life as someone with severe cerebral palsy. And Chris needed someone to bathe, feed, dress him every day of his life. He had a severe speech impediment, so he needed an interpreter. He had involuntary movements. He wrote books. He did some extraordinary things. But he listened to this thing, someone was saying it has to be persons with a disability. And he said to me, "Susan, I'm fed up with this. Do you call yourself a person with female bits?" Because from his perspective, it was his identity. It was him, and he wasn't pretending anything. And so I use both terms, and that's my explanation. And I ask you to do the same to honor the views of so many. So here I am. I had to say yes when I was asked to come, because actually you have such potential to impact and liberate the lives of so many people. You're so brilliantly placed to shift the way this subject is addressed across that complex public policy agenda that you are so influential and so shaping. I was very struck in the conversations I've had as I tried to get my head around your very complicated world, I can't pretend I have for a moment, by the determination to improve your own disability performance, because by so doing, you're going to enable people right across your policy agenda to have a better shot at the quality of life that we all take for granted. Surely the time is right. I was told yesterday that your premier has a public statement out there saying she wants a fair society. And again, this is a shift that I find really helpful now. Our job, all of us, is to create a more efficient labor market, which, because it enables disabled people to compete fairly for work, works better for everybody. The word fairness is really important here. And we'll know we have done our jobs when all of us, and all the people you talk to, can state without any hesitation, it is fundamentally no different to turn me down for a job because I'm disabled than to turn me down on grounds of race or gender. It's fundamentally no different. I think you'll find that not many people have quite got their head around that. Kind of go, oh, well, it must be different because they can't do stuff. But actually, when you're talking about fairness, it means the individual's having a chance to do what they can do with the kind of flex in the system that enables them to do it. So I was asked to talk about the demographics, the business case. And I think the first thing I want to say is we need to scrap the old thinking about this. On the one hand, I had a wheelchair-using young guy say to me not long ago, "Susan, why do they need a business case for treating me properly?" Because actually the word business case suggests that there's some reason for not allowing people to make you rich in your business. And the second thing, I think, came to me when I was in front of a select committee, a special governmental committee, an inquiry into why disabled people aren't working, and a rather hostile member of parliament started off the session with me and said, "Susan, what is the business case for hiring disabled people?" As though he didn't believe it. And I said, "Well, I think it's the same as for hiring Australians." And he kind of, "What?" I said, "Well, some of them can do the job. Why would you generalize about, I don't know, 30 million Australians? Nobody does that. So why are you going to generalize about millions and millions of people with disabilities?" We no longer ask, are they employable? Are they worth the bother? I mean, it's a weird idea. We have 3.5 million disabled people working in the UK. Do 3.5 million employers that have gone all fluffy and goofy? I don't think so. The real question now is, why does improving your disability performance deliver business benefits? Why is learning to adapt for human beings good for business? You can't generalize meaningfully about such a disparate, large group of people. So let's just stop wasting our time. But we can show that learning how to recruit on the basis of capability, learning how to manage people from a broader range of talents and capabilities is good for business. And so the example for me that really brought it to life, a friend of mine, Mike Devaney. Mike was someone born with cerebral palsy. He had a funny walk. He had a speech impairment so much that he always had with him an interpreter, like dealing with an Italian in a meeting. And he was the kind of guy who had been told as a kid, his parents had been told he'll never go to school, he'll never be anything. He ended up with a PhD from Cambridge. He was a counselor with the local authority, municipality, elected counselor, and so on. But the story I'm telling you now is when he went into the BBC to apply for a job as a producer. So he walks in with his funny gait. His interpreter says, you know, he talks and he sort of garbles and then his interpreter talks. The point of the story is that he got the job. And he got the job because that recruiter didn't get distracted by stuff that had nothing to do with his potential to actually be a producer. Didn't get distracted by the walk, by the talk, or anything. Now that recruiter is better able to recruit everyone on the basis of capability. Because if you don't get distracted by Mike, you won't get distracted by a woman, an ethnic minority, or whatever else that recruiter is looking at in what they would regard as a non-standard applicant. Let's look at some numbers. Everybody craves numbers, so I've got a few. 1 in 3, according to the European Commission, are disabled or close to someone who is. I think you just proved it's a lot more than that. But actually, if you live to be 70, you're going to have at least 10 years of disability. Most people plan on 70. And what we found in the UK in recent research is you've got at least 10 years if you live on the west side, where the money is in London, but it's 15 years of impairment if you live on the east side, in the more impoverished sections of the city. 1 in 3 50 to 64-year-olds will have a disability. People managing an aging workforce, the whole question of how you enable older people to contribute to society and not be, as one of our senior civil servants calls it, a burden on society. He's got lots of gray hair. I think he's poised to become a burden, as far as I could tell. Fewer than 8% of wheelchair users, 8% of disabled people use wheelchairs. It's kind of important if you've got people who think this is all about, you know, destroying my bathrooms for wheelchair users. 10% of the UK workforce has dyslexia. What are the numbers here? Not sure, but it means that most of you will employ people with dyslexia who, with a little help and a bit of flexing with your technology, would probably be a lot more productive. And 2% of the UK workforce leave work every year because of their impairment, because the employer didn't actually flex, or couldn't perhaps, but wasn't disability expert to keep him. The business case for me from the public sector for addressing the need to learn was really captured well by the former Director General of our tax department, Her Majesty's Revenue and Tax. And his job, as he explained publicly, was to get as many citizens as possible to fill in their forms online. He'd also realized that the average reading age of those taxpayers was between 9 and 11, depending on which research you looked at. So he reckoned that if he could get that form to work for people with dyslexia, visual impairment, color blindness, learning disabilities, the extreme users, it was much more likely to work for the guys reading at the age of 9. So for him, it was a no-brainer. He was just going to set up our technology task force and remove those IT-related obstacles. I'll come back to that task force in a moment. And I think you'll also find that if you get a disability competent system, it reduces the numbers of people flowing onto your benefit system, because the focus is less on just recruitment. The focus is on how do we keep people in work as they become disabled, because of course you are much more likely to develop impairments after the age of 45. Not that that would apply to anyone here, I'm sure. Now the thing about the stats is they're important, but they're not changing behavior, are they? How many of you have seen the Tim Horton stats about their retention rates and how good they are? So, did you rush out to hire people with disabilities in your own department because of the great retention rates? Somehow, it just doesn't work. And I think we have to accept that we need to shift deep-rooted unease, personal discomfort, reinforced by constantly talking about these almost mythological others, these stereotypes, not with them or to them. We had a survey recently in the UK, 65% of the general population saying they would avoid contact with disabled people in case they got embarrassed, didn't know what to do. And of all our little guides, we have a disability communication guide, you know, what you do, the basic etiquette stuff for different people with different impairments. We sold well over 1 million. It is still the most in-demand guide. The only way through, if we're shifting in a significant way assumptions and cultures and behavior and all this, is enabling key players, business leaders, counselors, policymakers, to meet informally with people with disabilities routinely. We call it our face-to-face strategy, constantly enabling our members to bring in interns, to set up, as KPMG has done, a customer advisory group of disabled people, to look at employees who already work for them. We have more than 220 disabled employee networks out there at the moment, acting as advisors to their own companies and their own public sector organizations about how to make progress and improve their own performance. The first thing we did was to bring disabled graduates together with graduate recruiters around a lunch table and say, what's getting in the way of both of you? And discovered the career fairs were a nightmare. So the companies joint-funded making career fairs accessible. I could have sworn that was what education should be doing. Our leadership development program was crucial. We set up from the beginning a program that enabled us to offer bursaries to high-capacity disabled individuals who were poised to really affect change in their communities. What they got was access to the in-house management training courses that were being run by the big companies. So Barclays is running a 2-day course on marketing skills. Our disabled colleague would come in with his scholarship and spend 2 days working alongside the guys in the bank to learn marketing. He goes out and sets up a social enterprise for facial disfigurement that's worked brilliantly. In the meantime, the managers he was working with will never have the same set of assumptions again about who's disabled, because they just got to know one in a completely different way. And of course, they've got connections. And so the barrier between the disability world and the business world starts to crumble. And in fact, I was thinking if I only had one thing to say today, if you'd given me 3 minutes, I would have told you about that program, and I would have said, invest in the leadership development of disabled people in your communities. Find a way, joint fund a bursary program. Are you all running in-house management training courses anyway for your own people? Can you open them up? Can you build a bridge with other companies so that they join? You'll find long-term transformational impact from getting these different relationships starting to bed in. And, do you know, I'm so hopeless with slides. I never use slides. I was supposed to have my logos up. Could you put my logos up? So these are the members, some of the members. These guys pay £20,000 a year to belong to something that tells them they've got it wrong about people they don't really rate that the board hasn't met. It's the old line. Next slide. And you'll find some of them, of course, working in this space. And so it might be, it gives you an excuse to knock on the door and say, people you've never met in your company in England have signed up for this. Why don't you do something about it? And now I was going to ask for my party with a purpose slide. This is a slide showing our parties with a purpose. At least once a year, sometimes twice if we can get the sponsorship. Very impressed by how you guys come together twice. We bring disabled individuals as leaders and members of the community, actors, athletes, interesting people, together with business leaders. We put them somewhere posh. Lately, every summer, we're going to the House of Lords, and we pour in lots of wine and we close the doors. Now, the point is, parties with a purpose give people a chance to go, oh, I thought disabled people were like that. You mean they're just sort of like this? I can have a drink with them. It's not as scary or as weird or embarrassing as I thought. And so, for me, your potential to bring these groups together informally must be huge when you look at your own networks. What also happens with the parties, of course, is it triggers this crucial insight for managers. Impairment is what happens to you. Disability is what we do to you. So impairment, my diabetes, the true story of a diabetic court reporter, got in touch with our helpline. For 7 years, she'd been sitting there in court. Every now and then, she'd take a break so that she could keep her blood sugar up, have a bit of a snack. As far as she's concerned, she has a health condition. It happens to you. Then she got a new boss. He wouldn't let her take any breaks. Suddenly, she has a disability. Suddenly, we're doing this to you. We're causing you to lose your job because this man simply refuses to make the adjustment, as we would call it, of a little break every now and then, when she'd proven for years she was up to the game. Another example more directly would be a blind graduate recently applied to a huge corporation. We know because she went online. You know, a lot of disabled people now don't sue you, they go viral. And so she went online because she had gone to apply for a job she could certainly do, and the application form was in PDF, and she couldn't access it. So she said, "Can I have it in Word?" And they said, "No." So blindness is her impairment. Disability is the refusal to let her apply. So a disability-confident organization asks, what could we do differently to make it easier for you to do your job? Almost the essence of the game. We have an investment bank that sends out that message to every employee on about a quarterly basis. They started by saying, what could we do differently to make it easier for you to do your job because you have a disability? And then they thought, that's kind of silly. Why don't we want to make it easier for everybody to do their job? And so now that's their focus. But because they've got the disability-specific skills, they know how to adapt for employees with different impairments, they're doing it much better. And what we get are things like Ernst & Young now have networks of employees who stammer, swapping notes about how the company can get best value from that. We've got an employee network in there just looking at dyslexia. The police service in Manchester has a network of police officers with dyslexia, 250 plus now involved. In fact, you should look at your police services. We have something like 27 police services in the world's only police disability network. Very, very powerful territory. One crucial thing that we do that isn't done in many places is we help the business community to visualize where they're going, to visualize what best practice looks like. Legal compliance isn't on. The legal compliance message is, I'm going to treat you properly if I have to. It's that resentful kind of thing. And particularly with really standards-based things where they can say, well, the curb is 2.6 inches up. That's all I have to do is the curb. The fact that you can't actually get to the curb because of that not working isn't their concern because the law doesn't require it. So I know you've got some new legislation coming through. I'd like to see a spirit here that says the law just spells out the basics. Our job is to turn that obligation to business benefit by making it actually work at a best practice level. So we define best practice. We call it disability confidence. 3 components. The company has to prove it understands how disability affects the whole business. So evidence, they've taught people stuff, learned stuff. They need to remove obstacles for groups, so that dyslexic graduate can apply online. Fat chance. You'll hear me obsessed with online recruitment and all the problems it's causing for every one of your vulnerable clients. Never mind just disabled people. And you're adjusting for individuals, because what's different here from treating, Canadian women fairly is you remove obstacles for groups according to the different impairments, because what's going to stop a blind person won't stop someone with a mental health condition. And you adjust for individuals, because no 2 people will be the same in terms of how they adapt for their impairment and for a particular job. So the question I have for you is, where would an employer in Ontario go to asking, so what does best practice look like? How do I get beyond legal compliance, even if I could figure out how to obey the law? It's a huge gap, and it's not just in Ontario. I wanted to stress also that best practice in employment cannot be left to HR, and certainly not diversity, because it has to include IT, facilities management, procurement. It has to look at communications, marketing, the whole business. So just to illustrate, it was procurement that buys Taleo. Are you familiar with Taleo? Hands up. The most notoriously inaccessible online recruitment system, and it's bought by everybody around the world, the big global companies. And so procurement decides to buy an inaccessible online recruitment system. When it doesn't work for various people with different impairments, HR blame IT, IT blame HR, and procurement's in the middle, saying you guys told me just to pay as little as possible. Now, the point I want to make is that when McKinsey's did some research for us, pro bono, if any of you know McKinsey's, I can't afford McKinsey's. It was better than joining us, but that's another story. McKinsey's found 1.3 million people in the UK alone who could not apply to most jobs online. And that is no better now, even though that research was done some time ago. We had a big bank open, high-rise, brand new thing, 8,000 new workstations with 8,000 right-handed mice. So 10% of the workforce is about to get a cramp, sore hands, and it all goes wrong. That's disability incompetent IT. It's a huge obstacle. And so we set up our technology task force, and we looked at how you remove obstacles there, and the 10-point charter out there is available for all of you to sign so that your organizations could publicly commit to removing these e-recruitment obstacles, the obstacles that prevent people from getting access IT to work for them when they're in work, and of course access for customers and service users. Why do the systems fail in between? We've got employers here, disabled people here, and the system in the middle. I wanted to take just a couple of minutes to say, it's quite interesting for me. They tend to blame the person for being not really up to it. And actually, to be fair to the agencies that help disabled people into work, many of them have no experience of business, don't know how it works in the world of recruitment from the inside of the companies, and don't meet successful disabled people. They don't meet the 3.5 million in work, so they get a distorted view of the capability from this talent pool. And of course, they blame the employer. The employer, how many times have you seen come and be educated as the pitch for the employer to turn up for conferences? It's amazing how people don't volunteer to be educated. But the employer is positioned usually as the problem doesn't, is for some reason deeply averse to employing people with disabilities, even hostile. For me, it's like watching a Coca-Cola sales team come together to say, well, the drink actually doesn't taste very good, and the customers are kind of dumb. And it's actually got nothing to do with us as a sales team, nothing to do with the way we market or present this, and nothing in there that says we're going to make it easier for the companies. If there's one thing that you could do that would transform the employment prospects of disabled people, it's to insist that the system regards the employer as the most important client you have. All the investment in the person now deemed to be your client, is wasted if the employer says no. The push is strong. You push people at the world of work in general and hope that one of them magically makes their way to a particular vacancy. But there's nothing to help the employer pull the right candidate to the right job at the right time. The only way I reckon to get that balance right is for at least 5 years to insist the system regards the employer as the most important customer you have. Better services for employers equals better services for disabled people. You cannot go wrong. The example I would give is the Autistic Society came to us and said, we have 50 people with CVs looking for a job. We put a group of companies together with jobs coming up that kind of matched. We brought the two individuals with Asperger's, the agency, the companies together. What gets in the way? The interview. The employers agreed to bypass the interview and do extended interviews. And in exchange for that, we went together to government to get funding for the job coach to help the manager as well as the person. More than 400 people with Asperger's into work as a result of that little partnership. I have some other examples like Project Search. Project Search, how many of you have heard of Project Search? So the question I would put to you is who in your organizations should know about Project Search? It's a really nice indicator, because if you don't know anyone who knows about Project Search, you haven't got the right job description in there. You need a role that is monitoring what's working. This is a way of bringing people really far from this labor market, usually a 10% success rate in work if they get that, into a 9-month internship. In the mornings, education is there to show them the nonverbal stuff, why getting to work on time is important. Did I say nonverbal? That was meant to be vocational. Then in the afternoons, you've got job coaches, and they're on internships across the business. They get 60 to 80% success rates compared to 10. And you just have to get in touch with Project Search, and they would be happy to help you to replicate. But the real question for you as a system is, why don't you know about it? Because it works for people in further education, labeled learning disabled, with the kinds of behaviors and skills and so on that would normally mean most people would assume they didn't have a hope of getting work. And this actually delivers. I had 5 things to say at the end as I move into, I'm going to leave town so I can say anything I want. It's kind of cool. I'm thinking maybe you guys could joint fund a central expert team like our members have. Because if I can measure the performance of a pharmaceutical in a big bank, maybe you could create a team of people that helped you to define what best practice looks like for your sector, in your complexity, because you've got to be able to respond to the employer and the person and the policymakers. So what does best practice look like? What should you all be saying? How do you measure your own performance? Maybe joint funding a central team that could collaborate with mine, pull out what we've learned, elaborate in what needs to be reinvented here. I do think you need to agree what best practice looks like. I don't know how you can get anywhere until you're clear. Please look at online recruitment. Maybe you could be the only jurisdiction in the world that tackles it as a systemic obstacle, stopping people with English as a second language, people who don't own computers, all the... it makes me so cross. Become exemplary employers yourselves. I think you gotta. And if you look at what it takes to get your own organizations to routinely attract disabled applicants and make it all work, you can take that learning into what you then apply, helping employers, helping individuals. But unless you can actually, in an exemplary manner, employ disabled people yourselves, part of me thinks, what right have you got to tell a bank? How do you do that? And everywhere I go, the public sector seems to think that this is a private sector problem. And then what I'd like to do is to suggest in a very concrete way, within 12 months, if you could list 5, maybe 10 things that could change, that would make it easier for the employer to say yes. And the way you do that is by asking employers, what would make it easier for you to get it right? I'm going to ask permission for one more minute. Because when it gets right, it's really, really cool. So the classic story for us, Boots the chemist, you know, the drugstore. I've only been out of country 25 years. I still remember drugstore. We watched as Boots was approached by the Autistic Society with a young man with Asperger's syndrome. And he had been described by the psychologists as rigid and obsessive. So you can imagine the HR director at Boots is going, oh, goody. Now, what they did, though, was because the staff in this agency were so good, they persuaded Boots to take a chance because they would be there to support the manager, to make sure that he was given the kind of direction he needed, and to support the person if it went wrong. Within 3 months, Boots came back to the Autistic Society asking for more. Because for the first time in the history of the company, I left out the bit, the job, was he was in the center of a distribution hub. He was sending out 40,000 bottles of shampoo there and 60,000 bars of soap there and 500,000 of these, right? So he was sending all this stuff out across Great Britain. And so, as I say, after 3 months of watching him do this, they came back and said, can we have another one? Because for the first time in the history of the company, they had 100% accuracy. So what the psychologists saw as rigid and obsessive was bloody marvelous for Boots. Thank you very much.